Great. Well, welcome everyone. I hereby open the regular session of the Springfield Planning Commission. Could we have a roll call, please?
For Springfield Planning Commission, Commissioner McGinley,
Present.
Commissioner Landon,
Present.
Commissioner Koivula,
Here.
Commissioner Gill, Commissioner
Present.
Gill,
Present.
Commissioner Bergen is absent, Commissioner Salzar,
Present.
and Commissioner Buck.
Present.
Thank you.
And I will go ahead and open the January 18th, 2022 meeting of the Wayne County Planning Commission. Perhaps staff can do a roll call.
Sure. Chair Dignam,
Here.
Vice Chair Schultz,
Here.
Commissioner Kaler,
Here.
Commissioner Smith, absent, Commissioner Whittle, absent, Commissioner Hadley,
Here.
Commissioner Kaczynski,
Here.
Commissioner Peacock, absent, Commissioner Snyder.
Here.
Great. Our next agenda item is the Pledge of Allegiance. So I'll just ask that everybody keep themselves on mute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Tonight, the Springfield and Lane County Planning Commissions are holding a joint meeting to deliberate on city-initiated amendments to the Springfield Development Code affecting residential and employment lands in Springfield. A joint public hearing was held on January 4th, 2022, and the record was left open for additional public comment to the Planning Commission through 10 a.m. today. Any comments submitted after 10 a.m. today will be provided to the City Council and the Lane County Board of Commissioners for their public hearing later in the spring. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to deliberate for the purpose of developing consistent recommendations to the City Council and Board of Commissioners regarding whether to approve with modifications, or not approve the development code updates. Before we begin our deliberations, I'll hand it over to the Springfield City Attorney to give a statement before we declare any conflicts of interest. So over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Chair. Conflicts of interest must be declared once per meeting on the same topic. Commissioners may only have a potential conflict of interest regarding the code update project because the Commission's future recommendation to the City Council and Board of Commissioners isn't binding. Commissioners with potential conflicts of interest must disclose the nature of the conflict and then can participate in the deliberations tonight. One example of a potential conflict of interest related to the development code update project is owning residential or commercial land in Springfield or the Springfield urban growth boundary because property values may be affected by the proposed code changes. So at this time, Chair, you can ask Springfield Planning Commissioners to disclose potential conflicts of interest. And I apologize in advance if my phone goes off during the meeting. I have a child in the hospital, so I'm sometimes getting texts and messages. So I apologize in advance if you hear that. I don't want to keep it on silent in case there's something urgent.
Thank you, Christina, and please don't apologize. Family comes first. So I will call on the Springfield Planning Commissioners to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. I'll start with myself, Commissioner McGinley. I do not own land, so I have no potential conflicts of interest. Commissioner Landon.
I have property in Springfield, so I have a potential conflict of interest.
Commissioner Koivula.
Same as Commissioner Landon.
Commissioner Gill.
I also own property in the city of Springfield, so have a potential conflict of interest.
Commissioner Salazar.
I have two potential conflicts of interest. One is that I own residential property in Springfield. The second is that I work for an affordable housing developer that operates in Springfield.
And Commissioner Buck.
Yes, I have two potential conflicts of interest. One, I own property in Springfield, and two, I work in the insurance industry and we provide coverage in Springfield.
Thank you, everyone. I'll hand it over to Chair Dignam.
Thank you. So at this time, based on that explanation from the Springfield Assistant City Attorney, I would ask if there are any Lane County Commissioners who wish to declare conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest. I have none. Anybody want to make that declaration?
Chair Dignam, Betsy Schultz here. I do have a potential conflict of interest in that I do own a piece of property in Springfield. And in my professional work, I represent the home builders of Lane County and the realtors of Lane County as well.
Very good. And I see Lane County Commissioner Kathy Smith just joined us. Kathy, if you could, well, first, we just did roll, so we now see Kathy is here. Kathy,
I'm here.
We just asked for potential conflicts of interest. If you could look at your packet, the Assistant City Attorney. Well, actually, Christina, I think it might be best if you give your explanation once again so Kathy can respond.
Sorry for the late arrival.
It's no problem.
Christina.
No problem. Commissioners may only have potential conflicts of interest regarding the code update project because the recommendations of the commissions are not binding on the Board of Commissioners or the City Council. And so, but those potential conflicts of interest have to be disclosed at each meeting the topic comes up. And an example of conflicts of interest related to the development code update would be owning residential or commercial land, for example, within the city of Springfield or the Springfield urban growth boundary, because property values may be affected by the proposed code changes.
I don't have any known conflicts of interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Anybody else, Lane County? Last call. Okay, we'll turn it back over to Commissioner McGinley, Chair McGinley.
Thank you. And I will just hand it off again to City of Springfield staff Mark Rust and Lane County staff Lindsay Eichner for a staff report.
Good evening, Commissioners. Mark Rust, City of Springfield. I'm going to share my screen here. As part of the introduction to your deliberations tonight, I thought I'd go through some additional slides for your consideration, and then we can refer to them in discussions if needed. When I'm in screen sharing mode, I won't be able to see everybody. So if there's questions or hands raised, you could just shout out, and I'm happy to be interrupted. Just quickly to go through, and I assume thumbs up from somebody about seeing my screen. Okay, you can see the introductory screen. Yep, great, thank you. So just briefly to go through the purpose of the overall development code update project. Again, I shared this last time, but I like to go through it every meeting in case the public is attending or viewing this later. So this is the purpose of the project, adopted or approved as part of the community outreach plan for the project. And also going along with the purpose statement, the approved objectives for the project. These were developed in conjunction with the City Council and approved by the Springfield Planning Commission, acting in their capacity as the Committee for Citizen Involvement. I provided these approval criteria at the public hearing, but just to go through them again tonight, I'm not going to read through them, but these are the approval criteria for the proposed development code update. These are detailed in the findings in the staff report that's part of the record and were included in the public hearing packet from the January 4th public hearing packet. I'll be referring to that previous packet tonight as well as tonight's current packet. Also here again is the timeline for the project, and just re-highlighting the yellow bars represent the phase 1 housing phase of the development code update project that's part of tonight's discussion and was part of the public hearing, as well as phase 2, which represented by the orange bars here for the employment lands, dealing with mostly the commercial and industrial lands. So with that, I wanted to just recap a little bit from my staff's perspective, what we took away from the hearing 2 weeks ago. When I was able to glance at the attendees, I noticed about 19 people or members of the public attending the meeting, virtually attending. I noticed about 43 participants that were panelists or consisting of the Planning Commission and staff, et cetera. Those numbers might have fluctuated throughout the 3.5 hours of the work session and public hearing that night, but I think that's a good measure. We had mailed out about 1,400 or so notices to certain property owners, including also publishing a notice in the Register Guard, an email notice to interested parties list, and also providing updated information on our project webpage. At the hearing, a total of 8 people testified from the public. Just my highlights of what the testimony included, primarily that there was support for the proposal. There were some questions and need for clarification. It seemed to me most of the comments focused on housing or middle housing. There, like I just mentioned, there were requests for clarification. There also was some advocacy for allowing more density, less parking, and smaller lot sizes. And there was some questions and concerns expressed about the historic district, protections for the historic district character, and tree protections in the historic district that we briefly discussed as follow-up to the public hearing. Prior to the public hearing, on the 4th, we had received 2 written comments that were posted on Springfield, Oregon Speaks. That's the platform that we use for managing our public input. However, I should have realized the Lane County Planning Commission isn't used to that platform, and we understood that the County Planning Commission hadn't had access to those 2 comments. Those are provided for you in your packet for tonight's meeting, along with a number of other public comments that came in either, I think one of them came in like 15 minutes or so, maybe just prior to the hearing last week, and then a number of others that were received between the hearing and prior to the packet going out. And then I'll also be summarizing, or we emailed out today. Hopefully you all received an email from Lindsay, at least for the Lane County Planning Commission and for Springfield Planning Commission from Brenda today with, I think 5 or 6, I think there were 6 other comments received since the packet went out. So a number of different avenues of public comments coming in. We want to make sure and capture them all. And then just a quick recap. The final recap point is that prior to the public hearing, we have an ongoing list of just all the phone calls and emails we had received prior to the public hearing. And we had heard from about 25 people. So one of the areas I wanted to just discuss a little more in depth is there were some questions and concerns around what exactly is happening outside the city limits, inside the urban growth boundary that the County Planning Commission is most applicable to the County Planning Commission versus what's happening inside the city limits. So we did reference that with the one change that we're proposing for eliminating the use of a single unit dwelling in the medium density and high density residential zones, that would also apply outside the city limits. There were 50 properties that are zoned in those 2 zoning districts outside the city limits. Lindsay provided some numbers or the spreadsheet to us in regard to the composition of those 50 lots. And again, these are just the medium density and high density residential zone properties outside the city limits. There's numerous other properties outside the city limits that have other zoning designations that the code changes would also impact. But this is just the impact from that one proposed specific change that triggered the Measure 56 notice. But only 2 of those 50 properties are vacant. One of the 50 properties is a private road. These are just kind of a quick summary of those 50. 4 of the 50 do not have a single family dwelling. Maybe Lindsay could chime in here. I don't know. I think based on these numbers, all the other properties already have existing single family homes. Was that the understanding?
It appeared that they all had a single family home. Now they may have more than that within ADU or something, but I didn't dig that deep. But they at least had a single family dwelling. Yes.
Great. So anyway, we just wanted to capture a little bit of that to help give some perspective on the impact to those specific zone properties outside the city limits. Another area I wanted just to discuss a little bit further. I touched on this very lightly at the public hearing. I probably should have gone into it more. I think it's more applicable just to the Springfield City Planning Commission, excuse me, because it directly deals primarily with middle housing. And the Springfield Planning Commission is well aware of and have gone through in fairly good detail these community survey results. But I think it's just instructive in some respects, potentially, to understand what those community results were. And so there is, as a part of the public hearing packet from January 4th, there is an entire public outreach report that includes the detailed community survey results. And so that just can help inform some of the discussion on certain topics tonight. I'm going to go through a little more detail here about all the different public comments we've received. There's a couple of, I think, 3 primary different categories of these public comments. I tried to just highlight some of the topics. I'm not trying to capture all of the comments. We're relying on the detailed written comments that were submitted for the complete comments. But just in terms of summarizing, these are what I captured. So again, prior to the public hearing, we had received 2 written public comments on Springfield, Oregon Speaks. The first was from Dylan Lamar. He also testified at the hearing. I think you heard from him. I think you will see his materials in the packet from tonight. I'm not going to read through all these bullets. If there's questions about them, I'm happy to go into any of them. The one thing I just wanted to note, he references a certain code section, a requirement for townhomes to face open space. He references 4.7.330. At some midway point of developing the code, we pulled some of all those middle housing provisions out of one section and put them back into the residential section. So that code citation changed. That was a pretty late development. So I'm not blaming Dylan for not catching it, but the correct citation, I believe, is 3.2.265, where that specific standard he's referencing is now contained.
Mark, it looks like you have a question from Commissioner Snyder.
Sure, go ahead, Commissioner.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with all of the terminology yet. So what is AMI?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe somebody else on my team can help me with that. I think it's average median income. And so that's, I believe, based on federal housing policy standards. Is somebody agreeing with that, or I heard something, but.
Sure, it's area median income. And so it's defined for each different locality. So it's specific to Springfield.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Does that help you? Sorry for the acronym there. It's actually pretty new to me as well, but that was from Mr. Lamar's testimony.
Yep, thank you.
Did that answer the question? Great. Area median income. Let's see, 2 other public comments written. Jim McLaughlin, he was in attendance of the hearing last week, but I noticed he had put in the chat he had to jump off and wasn't able to testify in person or virtually. But he and I have spoken about this comment. He is requesting some change or clarification around an industrial use category to include community health, safety, first aid, and EMS service. So that was his written comment on Springfield, Oregon Speaks. Again, that's in the packet tonight. Mr. Matthews had provided this email just prior, I think, to the hearing starting. I don't think I had captured this email prior to the start of the hearing, so I provided it tonight in the packet. He also testified verbally in the hearing last week. And he has some follow-up testimony as well. I think a total of 3 different pieces of testimony that are included, but this was the first he submitted prior to the public hearing. And then to go on kind of to the second category. So this is the trying to capture the public comments received after the public hearing, but prior to the Planning Commission packet going out for tonight's meeting. I included the commissioners here, 2 of the Lane County commissioners' comments, just to try and be complete about everything we received. Commissioner Hadley provided some very good detailed testimony. He and I have spoken on the phone as well about some of those comments. And Commissioner Kaczynski's comments, also some very good detailed comments, definitely highlighting some things that I think got overlooked. I'm going to go into some of these in a little bit more detail later, but at least 2 of these, of 2 of her comments focusing on the urban transition zone section itself, that was really helpful for us to take a second look at. And then some additional comments about just some clarification of text and providing additional definition. I'm going to talk about some additional definition language here in a little bit, but just getting through the rest of these public comments. Mr. Runick had submitted comments that are in the packet tonight about the Washburn Historic District, as well as Leigh Roberts comments about the Historic District, and Sella Meyer with comments about the Washburn. You can read those comments. Some of my takeaway on those historic comments, at least 2 of them didn't sound like they had heard my explanation on the Historic District impacts from a staff's perspective at the public hearing. I'm happy to kind of go into that a little more detail tonight to reiterate some of it. In addition to that, we have also created what we call a 1-pager. It's actually 2 pages, but it's a handout, kind of a fact sheet that we've now put on the project webpage specific to the historic district and how the impacts from the code changes will or won't impact the historic district. And then so that was emailed out. We have these e-updates we send to the interested parties list that people can sign up for on the project webpage. So let's see, it was last Friday, we sent out that e-update, providing that fact sheet on the historic district as well, and provided it to also our city councilor who's the historic district is in his ward. He's been hearing from a lot of folks. This is continued. So again, after the public hearing and being included in the packet for tonight is a second comment from Matt Matthews regarding the lot coverage and impervious surface standards. I'm going to talk a bit more about that as well, because he and I spoke on the phone and discussed a few things in that regard. And I know it was a topic of discussion after the public hearing. So then what we've received since the the Planning Commission packet went out, and I have 5 here. I think it's actually 6. Sorry, now I'm jumping ahead. I may have duplicated efforts here a little bit. I think the last half of this got transferred onto the next slide. Let me see. Yeah, so I'll just go with this slide. A little error on my part there. So these are the 6 additional comments we've received since the Planning Commission packet went out. You should have received these 6 comments. 2 of them were received through our SOS, the Springfield Oregon Speaks platform, and we printed those and provided those as well. Again, clarification from Matt Matthews, Rachel Verdon. This comment wasn't as clear to me. It referenced Commissioner Hadley's sewer line in the street. I'm not sure how that topic was applicable, but again, provide the comment for your consideration. Mr. and Mrs. Oglin, who have provided some comments about the development standards. Brian Thomas, he also testified at the public hearing and provided some detailed comments and some additional questions. We got a letter from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and then another comment from Stephanie Clark on Springfield, Oregon Speaks in regard to the Washburn Historic District. So any questions of that? I'm going to jump into kind of another phase here and talk through, try to pull together some of what the changes and things we're making. But before that, I see one hand, Commissioner Quavila.
Yes, Mark, to clarify your summation of the public comments, I believe that the comments from Ms. Clark in email and also in public testimony didn't just address the Washburn Historic District. I believe they did address the historic district, but there was also concern as to tree loss and I believe tear downs in other neighborhoods.
Okay, we could review the public testimony for that. I didn't capture that, so thank you for that. Tree loss and tear downs, is that what you said?
Mark, there's another hand from
Sure.
Commissioner Smith.
Great.
Mark, for the last slide, which was the public comment slide, what is the, just as I'm fairly new to the Planning Commission, what's the protocol for addressing those comments where you see they're relevant to the issue tonight? Do you address them specifically if they're relevant to the issue tonight before we take any action?
So I would say it's not, so this is a legislative process, which is different, quite a bit different than a quasi judicial process. If you're definitely welcome to address them specifically or generally, I would say also, and Christina Kraz may want to weigh in on this if she's available. I don't know. From my understanding, it's not required that we address them all specifically, if that's part of your question.
I will say, when I was recruited to the Planning Commission, that Jay Bosevich from the Lane County Commission said it's important to remember that you're not only on the Planning Commission, but this is the public input and the role that we have for ensuring that the public's heard. Given that not everybody sits around from 6 to 9 p.m. on Tuesday nights, you know how it rolls better than I do probably. So I just wanted to see. So when you say to me this is a legislative versus a block, or whatever you said, I'm sorry, I don't recall it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to understand what's the expectation tonight for responding to specific elements of public comment. And if you look at those, I appreciate that you've said we got this public comment, but what I don't understand is, do we respond to public comment based on staff recommendations or not tonight? What's protocol?
So I would say from a staff perspective, I don't intend to go through a detailed response to each and every public comment. I think it is definitely appropriate for commissioners to bring up individual comments or groups of comments and address them specifically if they have concerns about them. What I've tried to do is incorporate all the comments into the list of changes that I'm going to go through. And so
that partially answers my question. So as you've attempted to incorporate public comment, would you be kind enough to say this is a crosswalk, for example? And I'm not advocating any particular comment, but if you say this is a crosswalk to Ryan Thomas's comment that we received through SOS, this addresses his concerns in these areas, will that be part of your summary for us?
I think I can tie that into the discussion tonight throughout the conversation.
Thank you. I would really desire that.
Great. Thank you.
Let me chime in. Kathy, Steve Dignam here. When I read public comment, there were two that really struck me as being, they were all good, but two of them I thought were really spot on. And my plan is if Mark doesn't address that in his presentation, I'm certainly going to bring up those comments and ask for a more specific response from staff before I'm prepared to make any kind of a vote. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is if there's some public comment that you think it isn't addressed by staff during the presentation or by other commissioners, then that would be your clue to jump in.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the guidance and I'll take it.
And I completely agree with that. I mean, you can call me out or put me on the spot or whatever you want to do, and make sure you're holding us to the standard that you want met as part of this. Is your process. We're just here to help provide information. So anything we can do to help. Well, I'll be keeping a list. If there's follow-up needed, we'll provide that follow-up or additional information or additional changes to the materials and things to make sure we do cover it all. I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment. Again, I don't see the full screen, so if anybody sees something that I don't, it looks like Commissioner Smith's hand's still up, but I assume that's from her previous comment. So to kind of go through, hopefully to summarize a lot of these changes, or some of the changes at least. Unfortunately, a lot of different staff were working on compiling a lot of materials, and we were doing it fairly expeditiously to turn around this new packet. So I kind of apologize for the form that the memo took. It's in a couple different places. The very last page of your packet tonight, page 552, we reduced it down almost, 75 pages from last time's packet. So we're trying to save the amount of flipping here, at least electronically. But so attachment 4 to the packet tonight includes a list of 5 different things that are changes that we've made after the January 4th public hearing. So that's what I'm going to go through here quickly. And actually now I'm seeing a list of 6. So I think I may have divided one of them into 2. We'll see here. But yeah, I think on the attachment, we forgot to add a number 6. So 5 that's in the packet is actually 2 separate items. I was just going to say something else. Anyway, well, I'll go with this for now, and then it'll remind me of what else I was going to say. So there were some clear, typos or kind of mistakes. This first one number here, and it references the section of code. We talked about the minimum lot size for fourplexes and triplexes. So the state, and again, this is specifically related to middle housing. And I probably didn't get into too much with middle housing. I don't want to kind of belabor the fine points too much, but there's the set of minimum standards that the state is requiring us to adopt. We can go below that. We can't go above those. And depending on which standard we're talking about, that kind of flips on its head. So, but the largest lot size we can require for fourplexes is 7,000 square feet. We've changed that in the draft that was at the public hearing. I believe both triplexes and fourplexes were at 5,000. And then the 5,000 minimum lot size is the state minimum for triplexes. We can't go above 5,000 for triplexes. We could go lower. So we did hear some testimony on this issue. And honestly, in the code, we had flip-flopped back and forth a little bit in developing the code. And so the proposal in the public hearing packet to have them both be 5,000, I think is still a reasonable proposal to consider, but this could be a topic for discussion tonight by the Planning Commission. I think as staff, I'm asking for specific input on this topic. It's more related to the Springfield Planning Commission because it has to do with middle housing. And I'll just take this opportunity too to highlight that the request to kind of split out what in the code applies outside the city limits for the Lane County Planning Commission versus what applies inside. It's very difficult to do that. However, we did highlight some entire sections in the packet tonight in all the different code sections. We highlighted them in gray, kind of a gray highlighting, to delineate that those sections that are highlighted gray are specifically not applicable outside the city limits. So the assistant city attorney had provided kind of off the top of her head type of list at the end of the public hearing discussion last week, but primarily that has to do with middle housing and multi-unit housing. So I'm just flipping through the code now. The primary one for middle housing is 3.2250. Another one for multi-unit housing is the 4.7345 doesn't apply outside the city limits. And then there was one more that I just wanted to touch on for multi-unit housing, which is basically like apartment complexes, 4.7380. There, I think, is a couple additional ones throughout the code, but those are the big ones that are clearly, there's kind of the bright line delineation between what's applicable outside the city limits and what's not. And so the ones that have the really bright line on them are those middle housing provisions, primarily in the middle, or the multi-unit housing provisions. For the most part, the rest of it, we talked briefly about. All of the rest of it is applicable outside the city limits for the County Planning Commission to consider. But anyway, I just wanted to touch on that. So if there is detailed discussion that the City Planning Commission wants to have around those grayed out sections, depending on where we get to tonight, it may be worth the Springfield Planning Commission having a separate discussion about some of those grayed out areas if the County Planning Commission doesn't want to be bogged down in a discussion that may not be directly applicable to their jurisdiction over what's applicable outside the city limits. So anyway, with that, back to the list. The rear setback requirement for the R1 land district, we did change that in the code from 5 back to 10. And that's reflected in the table cited here. Same for the rear setbacks in the other. There's varied rear setback requirements for the R1, R2, and R3 district. And then the duplex minimum parking standard, we overlooked that. That is specifically a requirement straight out of state law. The most parking we're allowed to require by state law for duplexes is 1 space per unit for a total of 2 for a duplex. So we made that change. Here was another, this is kind of a cleanup type of a change for marijuana wholesale facilities. We're not proposing in general to update our marijuana regulations. This was kind of a legacy error or typo that has been in place since we adopted those marijuana regulations years ago. And it was just a clarification versus wholesale versus retail. So we just fixed that since it's an opportunity to do that. And then we also are proposing to add some electrical facility standards into the development standards section of the code. These were existing standards as part of the site plan review. We took the standards out of site plan review and put them into the infrastructure section and just didn't carry over this one specific set of standards for electrical facilities. So those are the primary changes we've made since the public hearing draft. But there's a lot of other typo and kind of what we're calling Scrivener's errors and corrections that we made. I'll just note here, I'm not going to go through each one of these. If there's questions about them, I'm happy to highlight them. But in the packet, I think what happened is our autocorrect actually corrected this typo in the packet for tonight. Unfortunately, it didn't correct it in the code when we released it. But this 80, this 80 that is an error in typing inserted into the middle of the word masonry. In the packet tonight, this is typed as just masonry and the error doesn't appear. But this is what we were attempting to correct. The typo can be seen in the code in the packet for tonight, but we are just clarifying that that typo is just the word masonry. So that was the only one I was going to point out because it got erroneously put into the packet tonight wrong as well. a lot of these were as a result of some public input we've received. Commissioner Hadley, a number of these changes are in response to your comments. So, but the other thing I wanted to clarify is we actually, even though we intended or intend to make these changes did not get made for tonight's code drafts. We were working on that, and I think I honestly don't know what happened, but for some reason I made the changes. They didn't get captured, and the code sections that went out didn't reflect these changes. So I had thought we had made these, and I think the memo is worded in that regard. However, the packet doesn't reflect that tonight. So we would propose or intend to make these cleanup changes. Some additional changes on that list are here. I'm happy to provide these in a, well, these are in the memo for tonight. So you have these in the memo. And then some other proposed edits. Again, these are mostly as a result of public comment or commissioners' comments. These are, 3 of these are dealing with definitions. I'm going to touch on definitions in a little more detail to highlight that they're topics that you could talk about tonight. And then again, I think, let me make sure I get the reference right here. Is it Commissioner Kaczynski, I think, pointed out the urbanizable fringe overlay zone changes to clarify and be consistent with the rest of the code, adding in accessory dwelling units and duplexes. So there's some proposed changes that would happen to those sections as well. Again, I'm not going to walk through all these. Here's a 4th definition for walkable distance. I'll just touch on this topic here briefly. So we, I think it's been about 3 or maybe 4 years ago now, we did a pretty large code update to implement a new transportation system plan, which is part of our comprehensive plan. And then we did code changes to implement that transportation system plan. Part of that was focused around a lot of transportation type issues. One of the things that was intended to be included in that TSP, for short for transportation system plan, was to include a definition. This definition comes out of, I think, either state law or our actual TSP itself. It's a pretty universal definition for walkable distance. So including it now makes sense to make sure we close the loop on that. So with that, I have a short list of topics for the commission to discuss tonight. We're looking for input on specifically these topics, as well as others we're open to talking more about. I'm going to just go through these 4 in detail a little bit here quickly. And I was going to turn over this lot size conversation to Elizabeth Decker if she wanted to just briefly discuss the lot size requirements, or to lead us in the discussion around the lot size topic.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, members of the commission, both county commissioners and city commissioners, for being here tonight. As Mark said, Elizabeth Decker, a consultant helping with this project. And so for the lot size question, since this inadvertent error about the quadplex lot size being listed as 5,000 square feet along with the 5,000 square foot size for triplexes gave us this opportunity, and there's some interest to revisit this question. And so I wanted to provide a little context about Springfield, as well as a bit of a statewide perspective about the process that led to these minimum statewide requirements. So Mark had highlighted the community survey that the city completed, which generally supported smaller lot sizes for triplexes and quadplexes. And so as I understand, that was taken, as well as some specific guidance that the state prepared, the research that they did to arrive at the 5,000 and 7,000 square foot minimum lot sizes for triplexes and fourplexes, respectively. So the consideration in terms of whether the commission would like to see reductions to one or both of those minimum lot sizes, some issues that you might consider in your deliberations. based on the state research, they found that, generally statewide, as you would expect, requiring a larger lot is going to increase the costs for individual dwelling units, primarily because it increases the land costs per unit, right? A 10,000 square foot divided into 4 pieces is more land and more cost than a 5,000 square foot lot divided into 4 pieces and spread between those. So that's certainly a primary consideration. There's also consideration that requiring the same minimum lot size for a triplex and a fourplex could increase flexibility because then a 5,000 square foot lot could be developed for either one rather than needing to quantify in advance, oh, this 5,000 is for triplex, but if I want a fourplex, then a 7,000 square foot lot would have to be planned for and created initially. So that could provide some additional flexibility if they have the same minimum lot size. And then the final consideration is thinking about, one of the other large considerations that were highlighted at the state level is thinking about what the supply of lots is in the city, and how that could relate to these minimum lot sizes. Because there's 2 ways that this could play out. One is if you have new development, that's really where you get to these affordability questions. If someone's creating lots from scratch, essentially through a preliminary plat subdivision process, they can be penciled in at 5,000 or 7,000 or some number in between. That does have the affordability and flexibility issues highlighted here, but it is possible to create them. The other issue is in existing areas where we're talking about infill. Larger lot sizes can disqualify some lots from being able to develop triplex or fourplex development. If there's an existing lot that's smaller than these proposed 5,000 and 7,000 square foot minimums. So we were able to discuss this with Mark and look at some maps that the city previously prepared. And what I understand is that this is less of a concern in Springfield, that there's a large number of lots in the city that already would qualify for the proposed 5,000 and 7,000 square foot minimums for triplexes and quadplexes. But certainly, lower lot sizes would cast a broader net, if you will, and quantify and include additional lots that would then qualify for this triplex and fourplex development. So those are some rationales that you could consider. I would also just, highlight that the state did consider all those issues, and their compromise solution was to arrive at 5,000 and 7,000 as being flexible and relatively lower land costs, but still providing sufficient lot area to make development feasible. So even if there were a much smaller minimum lot size for triplexes and or fourplexes, there's still, it's unclear exactly how much land would be desirable to try to fit that many units in. So, simply decreasing the minimum lot size won't necessarily, increase the number of units because it still has to fit onto the lot, especially once we start talking about these lot coverage and impervious surface standards that Mark's going to cover. So some considerations there. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was great. And I'll just highlight, I think along the lines of Commissioner Smith, you did hear some testimony and receive some comments on the lot size, both from Dylan Lamar and also Mr. Matthews. So they had both requested some considerations around the lot size. I think in particular, Mr. Lamar has advocated for kind of what he's called this deeper affordability. And so part of the question, and through being on the Rules Advisory Committee at the state level and developing the rules to implement House Bill 2001, part of the thought is, well, how are you going to fit 4 or, even potentially more units on, say, 5,000 square foot lot or 7,000 square foot lot? And really the discussion at the state level was that's essentially encouraging smaller units. And in theory, then smaller units are more affordable. And so it doesn't necessarily, given market factors, guarantee that it will be, but that was kind of the theory of the discussion. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. I see Commissioner Hadley has his hand up. Oh, and sorry, I'll just mention, Elizabeth mentioned that I was going to share a map. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull that map into the PowerPoint for tonight. I know the Springfield Planning Commissioners have seen that map before. I'll see if I can pull it up during discussions here. It is only inside the city limits and just highlights how widespread the extent of 5,000 square foot lots are and 7,000 square foot lots. But sorry, Commissioner Hadley, to interrupt. Go ahead.
That's fine. In my comment, because I'm Lane County, not Springfield, is very much a peanut gallery kind of comment. But the other public testimony you got was from Tim and Betty Olguin, who talked in their testimony about building on 6,000 square feet. So personally, as an interested bystander, it seems like these are professionals who have done it and say they can do it. So why not make it 6,000 square feet if these professionals believe that they can do it? And they're in the process of doing it. So that would be my kibitz on that one.
Yeah, and I agree. And thanks for pointing out Mr. Oglin's comments, Mr. and Mrs. Oglin's comments. You're right. They have actually done a development in the historic district, and it is essentially a triplex, or it's 3 units on one small lot under 6,000 square feet. They did it as technically one single family home with 2 ADUs, one attached ADU and one detached ADU. It's a pretty nice example of recent development that I think fits in pretty nicely with our historic commission. It demonstrates, or with the historic district, demonstrates that new development, especially new middle housing development, can happen in the historic district and be somewhat in sync with I think the desire of the historic district. So
yeah, and the other point of their testimony is that they also recommended keeping the height limit at 30 feet for blendability, which tells me that they are concerned about the appearance, about the aesthetics, about the architecture. So I tend to agree with them on both points. But again, I'm Lane County, not Springfield.
did I see another hand up? Commissioner Landon, did you have yours up? You're on mute, Commissioner Landon, or at least I can't hear you, but. Still, can anybody else hear Commissioner Landon? I still can't. It shows unmuted on this end. Maybe while you troubleshoot for a minute, Commissioner Landon, I think Chair Dingham was raising your hand.
Yes. I wanted to follow up Bruce's comment because I too noted the public comment from the Olguins, and they were powerful comments, I thought. So are you saying, Mark, that this 5,000, 7,000 question is one of those issues that is only relevant perhaps to Springfield planning commissioners and not Lane County?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Just a clarification though, I don't know if I'm thinking really literally about it being grayed out, but where's the grayed out? I was doing a mental cue for Lane County relevant information, and I don't see a gray out on this topic. So help me understand what I'm supposed to be. I want to pay attention where I should for Lane County for sure.
Sure, and so it's a great question. I could probably point you to where that information is. Yeah.
It's not grayed out in that specific line because it's within one table for all of the different types of middle housing, but middle housing is not developable in the urban growth boundary without annexation. And so this is one of those areas where we did not gray out the whole section because we would have had to go line by line in that table. But minimum lot sizes for middle housing is not effectively applicable outside city limits because you have to annex to build middle housing. So that fact that you have to annex takes you out of the urban growth boundary, obviously, and into city limits.
To clarify for anyone watching, when we say grayed out, we're referring to the meeting packet that's online, not the slides that are being shown right now.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. Commissioner Smith, does that help?
Yes, I needed that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, again, it highlights the difficulty with, specifying which specific pieces of language are or are not applicable. And I'm glad Christina was able to jump on and help me with that. It is the table we're referring to is table 3.2.215. It's on page 5 of 521 pages in the packet, or exhibit A, page 4 of 119. I don't know why this is the way it is. Unfortunately, there's 3 different sets of page numbers on every page. So I don't know which one's best to reference for all of you, but it's also page 4 of 35. So anyway, all those different page numbers. If you're not thoroughly confused now, I can work harder to do that. But let's see, Commissioner Landon, did you have any success with your microphone? I'm still not hearing you. I wonder if you could send a chat to Brenda maybe, or somebody could help maybe troubleshoot Commissioner Landon a little bit. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm working with him on it.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you, Brenda.
Yep.
We'll come back to you, Commissioner Landon. So anyway, all great information from Elizabeth Decker. Thank you for that. So that's one of the topics that I think we could and again, so throughout the deliberations tonight, I think one way to approach it is potentially putting topics into what we could call buckets or categories of topics. This might be one that goes in the bucket of city only things to discuss. And so depending on how far we get or how much discussion is needed to be had, if we are going to result in continued deliberations, I think it's up for the commissions to decide tonight if continued deliberations happen separately or in conjunction or together again at another meeting, again, depending on how far we get tonight. But if there's enough topics for just the City Planning Commission to have further discussion about, and then there's a bucket of county only potentially topics to talk about, or maybe even a third bucket of joint Planning Commission topics to discuss. I think that's where we could focus on tonight and then decide how we want to address all the issues in the best way. So just going through the rest of these, the second potential topic to talk more about is in regard to the lot coverage or impervious surface standards. Again, I think this was Mr. Matthews. He provided comments and testimony on this. He submitted 3 different sets of comments. His third one was just clarifying this kind of discrepancy about talking about impervious versus pervious surface. So really, impervious is a paved area where water can't infiltrate down through the pavement, essentially, or a rooftop. A rooftop or a pavement is impervious, where a pervious surface is like dirt or landscaping or rock bed where stormwater or rainwater can run down into the ground and percolate down into the ground. So this idea of proposing to change from a lot coverage standard, and just to remind folks, our current lot coverage standard is 45%, and I'll focus just on the existing LDR, low density residential, or R1. We're proposing to rename LDR to R1 district, which is primarily where we see the majority of single unit dwellings, your typical residential neighborhood, not so much the medium or high density areas. But the existing 45% lot coverage only counts the structure. So buildings, it does not count paved areas. So a driveway or a patio is not considered a structure, so would not be counted towards this 45% lot coverage. I think these discussions do include the county. I think because these standards would also be applicable outside the city limits for development in some cases. And so we've proposed a change going from the existing lot coverage standard of 45% to go to this impervious surface standard of 65%. And that is would include calculating driveways and patios, paved walkways, things like that. Some of the reasoning for that is around, I mentioned at the public hearing, the city of Springfield is going to be, or already is now, subject to a new stormwater permit by the state of Oregon, the DEQ. We're working over the next, I think, year and a half to implement that new stormwater permit. Ultimately, regardless of what lot coverage or impervious surface standard we implement, the stormwater regulations are kind of going to basically supersede that. They're going to control, because individual properties or developers are going to have to figure out how to handle all their stormwater runoff on their site. And that could depend on how good a soil they have. If they're on a bed of clay and the percolation rate for that soil type is really low, they maybe have to have a much larger stormwater facility than a property that has really sandy soils, for instance, and the water percolates really well into the ground. So there's a lot of unknowns about that. We're not trying to fully implement that stormwater permit yet as part of this process. But this concept of going to an impervious surface standard was floated. We actually did contemplate not having a lot coverage or impervious surface standard at all. It's like, if stormwater is ultimately going to dictate it, why have a number that may not actually mean anything? So we ran that concept by our technical advisory committee on this project. Ultimately, it was decided people like to have a nice number to point to and say that's your standard, even though we have to qualify that with this whole stormwater concept. I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about it here. And also because we're not fully implementing the stormwater permit yet, it would be tricky to not have a number now for like the next year and a half while we're still working on implementing that stormwater permit. So just as an example, this is part of Mr. Matthews' testimony. This is the air photo version of the diagram that he provided in his testimony. He provided like a CAD drawing or an architectural type, a drafting type drawing, computer generated drawing of one of these lots. This is fairly new development. This just happened within the last year or two. Here, this is R Street and 11th Place in Springfield. So these are 3 duplexes. Each duplex is on its own lot. So he just looked at one of these lots, and he and I spent about an hour on the phone together, and he walked me through his, assumptions he was making and calculations, and just to confirm he was on the right path. But basically what he came up with is this is conforming development today. This would be allowed. These lot coverages, I think, without looking up the number exactly, I think this is under the 45% lot coverage standard for building. So again, the structure just contemplates the building. As you can see, there's lots of driveway. And this development's a bit unique in that it has this shared driveway access, so it creates a lot more pavement than it might otherwise. But this is kind of that creative infill that's being mandated by state law for middle housing and allowing density. There's paved patios and there's the paved driveway. You can kind of see these gravel bed areas that are likely to be the stormwater retention on the site already. But so under today's existing code, this meets the lot coverage standard. Under the proposed code at 65% impervious, these would not be allowed. This development would, I think he calculated that it's right at or just barely over 70%. So his comment was, if you're going to switch to this impervious surface standard, you should raise it from 65 to 70. So this type of development could continue to happen. Now, again, I ran that idea or that comment by our engineering division. They provided me a reference. I don't have it at my fingertips tonight, but they all look at this standardized engineering manual that provides them calculations and informations and assumptions on how they design stormwater systems and things like that. And the 65% number came from this standardized engineering manual that's like a national reference. So anyway, we didn't just pull it out of thin air. But anyway, so staff is open to conversations about, getting rid of lot coverage altogether, going back or keeping the existing 45%, potentially still going to impervious surface area, raising it from 65 to 70, keeping it at 65, recognizing that we're going to limit development, those types of things. But with that, that's about all I had on that topic. I was going to switch to a couple more. I see Chair Dingham's hand up.
Perhaps the 65% engineering standard is wrong, because when I looked at that picture that Mr. Matthews provided, I thought his testimony was spot on. I said, isn't that what we're trying to do?
All right.
Aren't we trying? Isn't, a lot of this is trying to improve the opportunity for middle housing, and yet we're saying that's what we want to do, but when it comes right down to it, that's not really what we're going to put in writing. I mean, to me, that is pretty contrary to where I see our purpose here. And therefore, as of right now, anyway, this for me is a big obstacle. There seems like there's something wrong here that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, I share your concerns and or maybe frustrations. I think we've had some frustrating conversations here internally that, and I see Commissioner Smith agrees, that we're being mandated by the state to do middle housing, and we're also being mandated by the state to do this new stormwater stuff. It's like different state laws coming at us from different directions that we got to kind of juggle and figure out how to rectify it all. So I completely understand the sentiment and think, it's a tricky one.
So Mark, I realize we're still in the staff presentation. We don't have to go into deliberations right now, but I just see this as something that we need to resolve during deliberations. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I see Commissioner Cravula's hand up.
Yes, Mark, thanks for your comments on that. As I look at that development, it's clear that there's a private street, as Mark said, which is a rather unusual situation, so that instead of the lot line being behind the sidewalk, now the streetscape entirely, including the sidewalk and the asphalt access for all of those lots, has to be included in the impervious surface area. So I think that that's the problem there. Maybe we could be looking at variances or something to take care of this type of unusual situation. But in a situation where staff is recommending a certain impervious surface standard to prevent stormwater problems, which we know we have stormwater problems in Springfield. It's oftentimes our systems are too small to handle storm. And we also have problems with the pollution runoff due to the storm systems as well. I think with issues like that, I think it would be very unwise to go against staff's recommendation for impervious surface. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments at this point? I have a few more slides, hopefully not too many more. I think maybe half a dozen more, a couple other topics, and I may not be seeing everybody's hands or faces. So if I'm missing somebody, but I'm happy to continue on. The next topic's even a more fun one, parking. Parking is definitely one of those topics that gets people sometimes fired up a little bit. So let's go on through that. We'll try and bang through the rest of these and then give you guys time to talk. I'm tired of talking already, so I do enough of it every day. Parking. So there was a request by Mr. Lamar, I think, as part of the testimony to consider reduction of parking. Again, so this is specific to middle housing in some respects, but I don't think it has to be limited to middle housing. I think depending on how the discussion that goes, this could also be considered as part of the broader just residential development topic, applicable outside and inside. Some of the specific request was to lower the parking requirement. I think he was speaking specific to middle housing, but not necessarily. The current requirement for single unit dwellings, so just an individual house, is 2 spaces for a house. Now, when you go above that to a duplex or anything higher, it's 1 space per unit. So a duplex would be a max or a total of 2 spaces, 1 per unit. Fourplex, 4 total spaces. That's the most we can require by state law for middle housing. When our current, like for apartments and things like that, you know, I think reduces down to a half a space anyway, but there's some contemplation for where we might reduce the parking standard as well. Like I think he recommended within a 1/4 mile of transit stops or potentially transit corridors. So I think all these things are open for consideration, whether we want to reduce it for single unit dwellings, that kind of thing. A couple things I'll note is the community survey response. And again, this was specific to middle housing. So duplex, triplex, fourplex, townhomes, cottage clusters. You know, the majority of the 80 community responses were supportive of basically promoting or incentivizing or maximizing options and flexibility for middle housing. The one area where the responses fell on the other end of the spectrum was parking, and the responses predominantly supported requiring the most parking possible under state law, because, you know, just one, I think part of the perception is 1 space per unit probably isn't enough. And if that's the most we can require, we should require that 1 space per unit. Developers can choose to develop more than that. There's no maximum. We can't require them to develop more. The other thing I'll say is staff has continued with the recommendation for 1 space per, based on the community results and the discussion at our technical advisory committee, also recognizing that there is other state administrative rules being written right now. I think I mentioned this previously on the climate friendly and equitable communities rules that are being written to implement the governor's executive order. And it's anticipated that these new rules are coming in the next potentially year or less, or maybe 2 years, not sure. We'll likely revisit the topic of parking. It's not entirely clear, but anyway, where we've landed with our recommendation is 1. There, as you've seen, there's requests for less, and so that's just another topic for discussion. I'm going to crank through the last couple of these, and hopefully we can get to more discussion. I think the last area for recommendation for discussion is clarifying some definitions or providing 1 additional definition. So we heard some comments, I think, from Commissioner Hadley and others, just providing the best language we can for how we define driveway approach. Also contemplating, it's a new definition for our code, but the definition of kitchen. We do note in here that a dwelling unit isn't necessarily defined as having only 1 kitchen, but where the kitchen definition does come into play is in relation to an accessory dwelling unit or ADU. Also, the definition of lot coverage, I think, as pointed out in some of the comments, there's opportunity to clarify the definition for lot coverage, even though we may not use that still. I think clarify where that would apply. And then the last definition is this new definition of walkable distance. And we're in support of including this definition of walkable distance. As I mentioned, the intent to probably to have included this in our previous transportation system plan implementation code update project that got left out. So with that, really the recommendation, the ultimate recommendation from staff is to ultimately get a recommendation to the city council and to the board of county commissioners from the respective planning commissions. I think we got a little ways to go to get there and some discussion to be had, but with that, I'm happy to talk about any of this more or answer questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to all of you.
Commissioner Kaczynski has her hand up.
I just want to clarify a piece of process, kind of what do you need from us? Because I know at some point, whether it be tonight or some other night, there'll need to be a motion making a recommendation. And I noticed in the packet, in the memo section 9, it has a list of other proposed edits. And so, you know, as we get into discussions about those, the topics that just had slides, do you ultimately need, you know, recommendations to make proposed changes for all of those edits if there are changes that they want to be made? Do you need, hey, please include the Scrivener's errors? So kind of what sort of instruction do you need from us as a group?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I think that's a great question. And I know Christina Kraz is available, or hopefully available tonight. I know she's dealing with some family issues, so she may not be as available as we were hoping. Otherwise, she's given us a thumbs up. She's prepared with some kind of pre-prepared slides that she can also share in terms of tracking the topics and the conversation tonight and any future nights. But to capture what is maybe ultimately agreed upon to help formulate a motion. So we could refer to it as either like, okay, Christina's exhibit A list or exhibit B list maybe, or however we want to reference those. But yeah, I think including part of that list could be, yes, incorporate all the Scrivener's errors. I do want to highlight, and Christina could touch on this point a little more detailed, but with the proposed code update in chapter 5, the procedures section of the code, we're proposing language that gives the city attorney the ability to correct like formatting type issues and things that don't change the substance of the code. That's an existing provision we have in our existing municipal code. It's a practice that we have with our development code, but the explicit language isn't in the development code. So one, we're proposing to add that language that then would also get, even after the city council ultimately adopts this, if we notice a typo or some weird little, clearly an error, and we just need to correct that typo and it doesn't change the meaning or intent of the code, the city attorney can correct those things without a big public process at all. But even between the planning commission and the city council process or the board of county commissioners process, we can make edits and changes or make sure we get all the typos corrected and that kind of stuff. But I think including those as part of the formal recommendation is definitely part of what we're looking for.
Okay, thank you. That helps that we need to very specifically say, even if we don't talk about the definition of walkability, we agree with you that let's put it in there.
Yeah, right. Let's see, Commissioner Kaler.
Noted at the beginning, or someone did, a timeline, and so it would be helpful to me if we knew what the deadline is for this. I think I already know what it is, but
yeah, great question. I'm happy to pull that timeline back up. I can just verbalize that. So our ultimate deadline is that for at least specifically the middle housing portions of the code, recognizing that they're intertwined with all the other development code updates. The state mandate is that those are effective as of July 1st of this year. Now, starting from that date and going backwards, I have this detailed timeline on my wall hanging right here of all these different dates and a bunch of different, scenarios basically. But in short, from my perspective, to get a drop dead recommendation from both these planning commissions is basically March 15th that we would need a final recommendation based on that timeline. Part of the city council process is once they adopt it, unless they adopt it with an emergency ordinance, it's effective 30 days after they adopt it. And so that anyway, a lot goes into this timeline, but so that would give us a total of, I'm just counting off my calendar here, 1, 2, 3, potentially 4, maybe 5 more meetings if we wanted to meet every 2 weeks and the commissions were available, each of those. But that's kind of the most time that we're going to have. If that helps, I can go through that list of dates too, if it's helpful, and I don't know if the chairs want me to continue calling on people. I don't want to necessarily have to run the meeting, but I'm happy to. And I see Chair Dingham, and then I see a couple hands up.
Yeah, Sophie, how do you want to, Chair McGinley, how do you want to handle questions?
I think for this portion, I'm comfortable with Mark calling on folks.
Okay.
So I'll go Chair Dingham, and then I think.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, first of all, I'm hoping that we can do this in less than 5 more meetings. But
Me too.
That wasn't my question. I had a question regarding one other piece of public comment. Ryan Thomas provided comment, and I'm hoping you can respond to this. He said that he has a home on a ½ acre that's zoned MDR, and he's wondering, what does that really mean? So can you explain for the benefit of those property owners who perhaps are going to end up with a non-conforming use? What does that really mean for them in terms of future development on his property?
Yeah, great question, Commissioner. Thank you. I've read his comments. It's a pretty lengthy comment. It's about 1.5 pages, and it's detailed, and it's a great comment. It's great questions. And so I've dissected it and tried to really get at the core of it. So just a couple points on that. One is, so the issue of non-conforming. So a property can be, as he indicates, if we adopt the code that says a single unit dwelling on medium density residential, or what's proposed to become R2 zoned land, is no longer allowed, and his existing home becomes non-conforming, it doesn't mean it's non-conforming forever in perpetuity. So he could, I think he said he has a ½ acre, he could add, well, let me just, so things can, I guess the point is, things can go from non-conforming to conforming depending on if he does additional development. So just because he may become non-conforming doesn't mean he's forever non-conforming. The whole idea of, he mentions the abandonment and non-conforming and how abandonment works. We have an existing provision in our code, and maybe Christina can chime in, make sure I'm getting the right number. I think it's 6 months. If somebody discontinues a use for 6 months, then if it's non-conforming, then they lose like the ability to reestablish that use. Is that I'm seeing your head nod, 6 months is the right number, Christina?
Yeah, and we rely on them to provide evidence to refute that, to show that there was some single unit dwelling use. And I think that we've been in the past, we can be flexible. So if someone is remodeling, like not living there, but remodeling it actively for the purpose in the interior for the purpose of living there, then I don't know that that would count toward abandonment.
Right.
So we look at whether it's being used in a way that's consistent with a single family dwelling, rather than has this been someone's primary, residence for long.
And we've dealt with these. Yeah, we've dealt with these issues before where, somebody might be a snowbird and travel, to Arizona for 6 or 8 months out of the year and only come, or have a vacation home. It doesn't mean because you're not in it physically that you've not been using it as a single family home. One piece of information we've used in the past is, have you continued to pay utilities on it? Well, if you're paying for heat and water or whatever, you haven't really abandoned the use. If it falls in disrepair and it becomes under building code not habitable, I think that's a bright line for saying, well, then it's no longer, the use has been abandoned at that point if it's not a habitable structure. So a lot of different things come into play when we're talking about abandonment. So when he testified at the public hearing, there was a little bit of back and forth questioning, and I tried to clarify a few things. The most specific thing he said at both the public hearing and this additional written testimony is adding units like a cottage cluster. So he's mentioned cottage cluster a couple of times, and on a half acre, with the specific cottage cluster, which is one of the middle housing types, there's no maximum density at all for cottage cluster. You could do, some exorbitant number like 50 units. You could do 200 square foot little tiny homes and do a whole bunch of them and have it be a cottage cluster meeting all the other standards. But it's very clear in the cottage cluster provisions specifically that an existing single family home is allowed to remain and allowed to be counted as part of that density. Even if he were to say, again, half acre, there's some nuances that come into play about meeting minimum density. And he does mention that in his comments. The minimum density that he brings up, I would think, is probably one of the biggest potential hurdles for him not being allowed to basically have the single family home by itself on the half acre. Well, and let me put it this way. He couldn't just add one more unit on that half acre and be a duplex because it doesn't meet the minimum density standards of the MDR zone. So as long as,
Before you go into too many more nuances, then is it fair to say that the new code, the proposed code, is not going to impede him from continuing to use his property as is and to develop it subject to obviously some standard restrictions?
Yes,
I go into all the nuances.
Yeah, I'm confident that he could, and what I glean from his testimony is he's not going to have a problem. There's too many development scenarios to kind of go through to, be exact. There probably is an opportunity that we could come back with like a clarification of the language to give him some more assurance that what he's asking about could be more explicit in the code. You're on. Oh, yeah.
You've answered my question. Let's go ahead and move on.
Okay. I don't know who was first, Commissioner Hadley, or I thought I saw somebody else put their hand down. So Commissioner Hadley.
Two things. First of which is extraordinarily detailed, but in section 3.2, it's page 28 of the PDF. You talk about window and door coverage, and the code as written says that we've got to have at least 15% of the elevation be windows and doors facing the street. But if there's a second building behind the street facing one, it's exempt. So does that mean, in theory, I could have a horizontal duplex along the street and a concrete slab behind that that's a fourplex? You understand?
I think I understand. And I think the short answer is yes, essentially.
Okay.
So, and I'll just touch on, this is a middle housing provision. This is the provision directly out of the state rules for implementing middle housing.
And Mark, I'm not making a recommendation or anything. That just seemed odd to me that would be permitted. But.
Well, and so part of the I guess maybe philosophical part of the conversation is, so this is the most intense design standards under state law that we're allowed to implement on middle housing. There's some, if you look at the community survey results, and again, I know this is middle housing, but there's some encouragement to say we shouldn't even require this 15%. We should just leave it up to the developer. If they want a big, ugly blank wall facing the street, let them do it. Is the city's business and telling them that they have to have this many windows. And then expanding on that rationale is, we don't regulate that now for single family homes. Somebody could build a big ugly concrete box of a single family home. Now, barring that you have to have ingress and egress for fire and to meet building code and things, but we don't regulate the design of single family homes at all. So why do we really have any business in regulating design of middle housing types? And so, you know, it's part of the discussion is, should we be, the state laws give us the ability to do this bit, the little bit that we've proposed, but we don't have to.
Okay, my second is just an editorial comment, and that's bouncing back to the parking issue. I think that you and the staff have landed on the correct compromise regarding parking. I really admire and respect what Mr. Lamar has done in his projects, and I think that what he's proposing is the future. I think in the future there will be cities that have 0 parking spaces. But and I also understand the survey response who want to park their RV and their boat and their Jeep and their ATVs. But that's not going to work in the future. So I think what you've landed on regarding parking is the correct compromise. No comment necessary. Last thing I've got is page 481 of the PDF talks about solar. And I understand from our last meeting, you did away with solar requirements for simplicity's sake. And now on page 481, we have a thing called a solar access protection application. Is that ad hoc? Does that mean that if a building is coming in next to my little house that has solar panels, that then I have to apply for it? Or how, just walk me through the pros and cons. I don't have a dog in this fight. One way or the other. I just want to understand.
And I see Christina popped up too. I'm sure she could speak a little more eloquently about this than I can, but I'll just say, so the reference to the page 481 that you cite is existing code language standards. So we currently have 2 different standards in our code. We have solar setback standards, and then we have this solar access permit is what I'll call it. So we're only proposing to get rid of the solar setback, not the solar access permit, as you rightly kind of pointed out. The solar access permit is provided for under state law, and it follows state law in that regard. So your example of if you have solar panels and somebody comes in to build a building next door, as you want to protect your solar panel, you would have to apply for this solar access permit for your property that would effectively put an easement on your neighbor's property to prevent them from building to block your solar panels. I'm not sure if that's what you mean by ad hoc, but it would be incumbent on the person who wants to protect their solar system or provisions to, and it is a land use process that neighbor then can comment on and fight potentially that easement being put on their property so that it doesn't encumber their property. So
doesn't that mean that every single story house with solar panels puts a real throttle hold on all future higher density buildings, higher density residences?
Yeah, and Christina, do you want to speak to any of that as well?
So someone who has a solar energy system has to come in and apply for this permit protection, and it's not automatically granted by virtue of having solar panels. We're not aware of anyone coming in the last decade. Maybe we've granted one of these in the past. State law allows local jurisdictions to have a process to allow people to apply for solar easements for new construction and new vegetation. It doesn't, it can't be granted to block or require someone to remove what's already there. And it can't be granted for construction that's been already approved but not constructed. So if I learn that my neighbor's got a building permit and I've got a solar panel and they've been granted that building permit, I can't then try to get a solar access easement to stop them from building what's permitted, but I can temporarily put a hold on new construction while my permit's being reviewed for new applications or permits. And it is a noticed process. It's not easy. So I would say that it's unlikely for many people to come in for this type of permit. If the the generally applicable solar access easements go away, we may see more people interested in getting one of these sort of one-off type of easements because the code will no longer just generally prohibit certain solar encroachments. But it also changing the existing solar easements would not negate any of the solar access permits that have been granted in the past. That's another question that we've got. If somebody got a permit under the old standards, would changing the standards now somehow remove what easements they have on their property? And it wouldn't.
Well, so is that a disincentive? Does this mean there's a disincentive? If I live in Washburn and there's a vacant lot next to me to the south of me, there's a disincentive for me to put solar on my home because I know that a 30-foot building could go up next to me?
I am not the expert in terms of what's a market incentive or a disincentive. What I will say is that if you have a solar system and you have a vacant lot next to you to the south that could potentially block your solar access, then that would be an opportunity to apply for the solar access easement.
Before any building is even proposed.
Right, before a building is proposed.
So
and then if approved, it would block a certain height of building in a certain, but based on those solar envelopes and the math that's in the ordinance.
That's what I meant about a throttle. I mean, the solar enthusiast could theoretically block any development on that vacant lot. On the other hand, if I don't have that approved application to protect my solar panel, the building to the south of me could suddenly wipe out my $25,000 solar system.
It's unlikely to block any development because it's an angular window. So for most, depending on, there could be properties that end up unbuildable, but the solar window has to be part of that application. So when the notice gets mailed out to those adjoining property owners, they would have notice of how much the proposals restricting them. And certainly if it was going to entirely restrict any development, that's one of the criteria factors that the planning would look at, is if this is going to prohibit any use of another property, then that's not something that's likely to be approved in that way.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Again, I'm not making a recommendation, I'm just trying to understand. And I was kind of surprised that there weren't any public comments on that particular topic, but thank you.
Yeah.
Other
Seeing,
topics.
I'm not seeing any other questions. I wanted to do a bit of a check. Last time we did a break after about an hour. It's been a little over an hour and a half. I'm trying to read people's eyes. Can we maybe take a 5-10 minute break? Commissioner Hadley, did you have a comment on that?
Sorry, everybody. Mark, you and I have talked offline about some things that I really object to in this document, but are not pertinent, mainly having to do with annexation. So how do I get those comments, those objections on the record to scoot under the nose of the Lane County Commissioners? Do I bring them up in this meeting, or do I send a letter to you? Do I send a letter to Steve? What do you suggest?
Yeah, and so I think there are topics, and I discussed this with the chairs in the pre-meeting, and I envision the potential to have kind of two parallel or companion recommendations, and it could be applicable for the County Planning Commission to their board and or the Springfield Planning Commission to the City Council. And that is, if there's topics that are what I'm going to frame as outside the scope of this project, and that's not maybe always a clear line, but that there could be, in addition to the formal recommendation on the code moving forward, there could be a secondary and companion recommendation that here's some policy ideas or thoughts or things we want the elected officials to consider. And so we're also forwarding this other recommendation we're asking for your consideration of these things as part of this opportunity for us to think about it holistically. And so in my mind, as we discussed, Commissioner Hadley, annexation is outside the scope of this. It's a bigger, broader policy discussion that the City Council and Board of County Commissioners could have, and that you could recommend that. I think bringing it up in this process and potentially making a motion to see if the majority of the rest of the County Planning Commission wants to support that motion to forward a parallel recommendation that's separate from the formal recommendation on the code. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm still looking for guidance. So Chairman Steve, what do you suggest?
Well, first of all, if it's a matter pertaining to Lane County,
yes,
you can certainly bring that up during one of our Lane County work sessions. The staff often asks, well, if there's other topics that we think we need more training for, or that we think need to be further discussed. It feels to me like maybe this is one of those topics that you think ought to be further discussed. But again, it doesn't seem to me to really be relevant to a vote on this particular item.
Agreed.
So I would
Agreed,
suggest
except that
it up. Sorry, go ahead.
Agreed, except that it's in the code here. So this is my opportunity to say, or this may be my opportunity to say, this is an example of the kind of code that municipalities are adopting that have a greater, grander, more adverse effect on Lane County. But again, I don't want to bore everyone from Springfield with my Lane County issues. And I don't even know, maybe nobody on Lane County Planning Commission agrees with me. So, and I also don't want to stand in the way of a break, because I know everybody wants a break.
You could make a motion to amend, if we make a motion to approve and you wanted to make a motion to amend it because you're not particularly fond of some particular provision, you could see if it gets seconded and if there's discussion and if people want to vote on it. Otherwise, it's pretty much just Bruce voicing his concern about a particular topic, which doesn't necessarily hurt anything, but it might not really accomplish what you're trying to do.
Right. So let me sit on it for the time being.
I'm thinking a recess wouldn't be too bad, and that seemed like where Chair McGinley was going. What do you think?
I concur. Is there preference on 5-10 minutes?
5.
Show of hands. 5. Okay, 5 minutes. So at 7:50, we will return. Everyone go get a drink of water, shake out your legs.
Okie doke.
Mike is back. So just wanted to return to his question.
I just had a question about, one of the things, I used to live in South Chicago, and does a smaller lot size sometimes result in a bit more of what we might call a cement neighborhood, where we have insufficient green space, and sometimes it seems to such neighborhoods develop greater crime rates and increased poverty. It's sort of, high density urban environment. I'm not talking about high rises. I'm talking about jamming people to better on smaller lots. And that's the only thing that I have as a concern for this increased density. Mark, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, we've heard similar comments. I referred to the Rules Advisory Committee I was on at the state level for how to implement middle housing. Similar sentiments were shared. It's interesting to me for the state law for middle housing, City of Springfield is categorized as a large city. To me, depending on your perspective, Portland is barely a large city, but for Oregon, Portland is the largest city. It's clearly a large city, but for Springfield, I had made a comment at one point that I'm not sure how Springfield got categorized as a large city, but anyway, we are. To me, we're a large town going through some growing pains, becoming a small city. I grew up in Eugene. Eugene's grown a lot in the last 40 years, but and so has Springfield. But I think I don't know. It's definitely a concern. I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I'm not sure you framed it as a specific question for me to answer, but I think part of, we were just talking a few minutes ago about the design standards and 15% windows and things like that. There are some standards, at least for middle housing in place. It doesn't mean it necessarily has to be middle housing either, but we have to figure out a place for people to live. I mean, we clearly have a housing crisis here locally, statewide, nationally. Affordability is a tricky one to solve. So how we do it in Springfield versus how other places might do it, you know, might help with some of the concerns that I hear you and others expressing. But for the most, you know, and I'll just take this opportunity to mention a follow-on process to all of this is a companion piece of legislation with House Bill 2001 was also House Bill 2003. So part of the statewide planning program and framework is we have to provide enough land inside the urban growth boundary of each city to provide for the anticipated growth over the next 20 years. You know, the state laws are becoming tighter and tighter around all of that. Portland State University is their housing, I think, and policy analysis group, or no, the population center is the one that provides those population forecasts that we all have to use to base those numbers on. The new House Bill 2003 requires us now in a different way than we're all used to do this housing analysis, housing needs analysis, and then do analysis to show how we're going to meet the housing needs. You know, goal 10 is the statewide housing goal that has been in place since the early 70s to also dictate or show how we have to do that housing analysis. Some think we just haven't been doing it quite rightly as directed by goal 10, but it's clear that we haven't been doing a good enough job in a lot of policymakers' minds. So that's why this new housing 2000 or House Bill 2003 has come through, and now requiring us to do it in a more detailed way. And so that work the city of Springfield will have to be doing over the next couple of years. We have a deadline to do all that new work. We're still trying to actively hire more staff to staff up to respond to a lot of these new state requirements. But through that process, it's going to be a little bit eye-opening, I would say, to and also I keep mentioning this climate friendly and equitable community stuff. It's also going to have a whole nother new slew of requirements probably for the city to consider. And so, you know, from a statewide perspective, I keep using these words like making us do these things and implement on us and we have to do, but you know, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, but it's just the structure of the state laws that we do have to respond. We're being required to respond. And so in some respects, we're being required to become more dense. And that's, I just think, part of the reality. So being intentional and responsible as citizens here and you as citizen planning commissioners and how these things are done, so we don't destroy the livability of our community while we're trying to provide housing for people in our community to live. So sorry, that was a long-winded way to not say much probably, but.
Commissioner Schultz has her hand up.
Thank you so much. And yeah, Mark, I agree with a lot of what you were saying. I think as we're considering all of this, we kind of have to keep in mind there is state mandates that we are required to implement on the ground. But that said, I think as we look at this, we're being offered an opportunity versus being trying to protect our communities from housing. We desperately need housing. I think that the median price for home sales in Lane County this last month was over $400,000. And the average person has no hope of ever being able to afford that if we're not able to create more opportunities, smaller lot sizes, smaller homes. And you know, family units are changing as well, so that the demand is shifting from you know, a single unit on a large lot to being more dense, and it's going to be a perhaps a slightly uncomfortable process, but I think that this is giving us that opportunity to get there.
Thank you, commissioners. So trying to have us not go until 3.5 hours tonight. And so something I'm curious about is we have the opportunity as we continue deliberations to do our own deliberations as the county and as the city, and then come back. We can go through them jointly the entire way. I would like to hear from you. I'm trying to keep track on sticky notes what each of the buckets are, the things that do require further deliberations. And so if I could get commissioners to let me know the things that you'd like to continue talking about in our deliberations or begin talking about in our deliberations. I can keep track of that, and then we can make a call about whether it makes sense to separate for part of our deliberations before coming back, or if we need to stay together. So far I've heard lot size, lot coverage, and parking. Are there any other things that folks would like to deliberate about? I see Commissioner Kaczynski.
I think one of the things I do want to make sure that we do, if we do separate, is that we do provide a consistent recommendation about sort of non-controversial things. That there are a few things in there surrounding some of the definitions, like the kitchen definition, things like that. And so what I wouldn't want to see is if we split off, there's a recommendation from one side that says, change the definition of kitchens. And then there's a recommendation from the other commission that says, don't. So if at least in a joint thing, we could look at some of those things that are maybe don't require a lot of deliberation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Kaczynski. Commissioner Buck.
Yeah, it seems to me that we would want to definitely kind of hear all sides. One of the things that stands out to me is this isn't a process that we go through often. This is a process that we go through, once in a great while. And as it stands out to me, the footprint of Springfield and the county and where those interact is certainly going to change over the course of time. I think that could look different long before this code gets revisited. And so I think that with consideration of that, I definitely would appreciate hearing what the county commissioners have to say. And also I agree with Commissioner Schultz in the aspect of an opportunity. And it's not that we don't need housing, but I kind of worry about how these changes are really going to impact what our community is like. And those are some things that I think about in this process, because those changes are going to be significant. So those are kind of my 2 cents on this.
Thank you. And Commissioner Schultz, is your hand up as a holdover, or did you want to be in the queue? Great. And I forgot after the recess, just thank you staff for the staff report and all of the work being done on this. Behind the scenes, Mark was on the rulemaking advisory committee for the state. As a planning commission, we've met many times on this. So I appreciate the continued work of the city planning commission. And then I have no idea how the county planning commission is digesting this so quickly. So thank you for the robust comments, both written and verbally. We're all in this together. So other items to note for things you would like to deliberate with the commission, those buckets, Mark was calling them. Commissioner Dignam.
Thank you. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the impervious limitation is a matter that I will want to have more discussion.
Thank you. Commissioner Cuevila. Looks like you're muted.
Hit my wrong mouse. I've got 2 computers going. Yes, one thing I'd like to perhaps consider would be a discussion of incentivizing different types of developments. So for instance, if we do decide to go with the parking standard as it exists, is there a clear path that we can develop for instances like that which we received public testimony on for the greater affordability to delete the parking requirement based on something like guaranteed affordability of the housing or that type of thing. So I'd really like to have a pretty serious discussion about ways we can have both the state standards in general, but that we can be flexible to accommodate differing conditions and perhaps bring in more housing. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Buck.
Yeah, one other thing that occurred to me, I know that the Springfield commissioners have talked about it some, point that Commissioner Cuevas has brought up that I appreciate, is how this includes, how this incorporates green space and what the role of that could be within the code. And I don't know, Mark, how all this falls. That may be a separate issue that falls outside of this. But in my mind, as we're moving these lot sizes the direction we are, being able to have that opportunity to protect green space and give neighborhoods that becomes pretty important in my mind. But again, so I'd appreciate more discussion on that and how it relates to what we're recommending.
Thank you, Commissioner Buck. Mark, did you want to respond to that?
Just a quick thought on that. I have given that quite a bit of thought. I know Commissioner Cuevas has brought a little bit of that up before. And I don't know if this hits on it, but just maybe an idea for consideration is similar to, I think, what Commissioner Cuevas was just talking about, incentivizing certain development. You know, that we have the opportunity to do what's minimum required by state law for middle housing at least. And so parking is one of those, but then have a reduced parking standard, say for, you know, either affordable housing or proximity to transit, which we already have some standards for. But around the green space issue is it might be, you know, the request for a smaller lot sizes going below the minimums, say for the certain housing types, may be balanced by some creative solution around. I think Commissioner Cuevas threw out the idea of, you know, buying into a green bank. And again, I don't know if that's probably a bigger policy discussion to have at the city council level with how to establish that or implement it. I'm not sure, you know, how we do that in code specifically, but it's just some creative ways to think about or discuss. I think what part of what you're talking about. And, you know, I'll just mention too, Willamette Lane Park and Rec District is the park district in Springfield and does a fabulous job with building parks and providing some green space and things like that. But how or if there's any tie to that, I'm not sure how that might work. But again, food for thought.
Thank you, Mark. I have Commissioner Gill followed by Chair Dignam.
Thank you, Chair McGinley. So I agree with the the green space conversation and the incentive conversation. I'm also interested because it showed up in a few places, not just the more recent public comment, but in the survey about the idea of sort of de-incentivizing demolition of existing, rehab of existing to become multi-housing. There's a lot of environmental considerations around that. Well, I get that maybe losing one dilapidated single unit dwelling from a housing perspective to bring in a whole bunch of other housing is a thing if we do it everywhere. I just think that that's an important conversation to have, and it also feeds into gentrification issues. It feeds into where, especially if we tie incentives to affordable housing, like where are we tying those incentives and what kind of demolition events start occurring in those areas, and then what does that mean for livability for the people who end up living in the affordable housing? So I feel like it's worth having those conversations. So the demolition issue, and I think we could also touch on the historic district in that I think some people didn't feel totally satisfied with the responses around that, because the economic impact is a factor in the historic district's demolition review. So people could say, well, I could, put money into this single unit, or I could demolish it and, have 5 units on this lot. So I feel like that's an important conversation to have. And then the idea of ownership. So there was a lot of conversation about the ability for people to afford and access home ownership happen. So what this housing looks like, does the way we're doing it impact ownership? Is ownership something we want to be working toward? What does that mean for a community if there are affordable homes to own? And that was brought up in public comment quite a bit as well. So I feel like those would be good conversations to have. Thanks.
Mark, did you want to respond before Chair Dignam?
Yeah, just one sec. Oh, I'm not muted. Sorry. I thought I was muted. So, yeah, just if I could, just a couple quick thoughts. And one is, so I think Commissioner Cravula had brought up during the public hearing the concept of gentrification or displacement. I actually had prepared a couple slides tonight. And if I could just share really quick on this, because I think it was Elizabeth Decker today, just as a result of one of our meetings, pointed me to this document that I wasn't necessarily aware of. And so I'd just be able to point the commissioners to it. I don't know what I'm doing now. I think I'm trying to share my screen. I'm not sure I'm doing it correctly, but let's just see. I might have to come back to this. Are you all seeing my screen at all or no? Not yet.
No, click at the bottom, Mark, where it says share screen.
And that disappeared on me for some reason. I'm not sure where that window went. So I lost something.
Pull your mouse down to the bottom and it should pop up.
Sorry, I'm getting there. It's just, I think you're all seeing yourselves now. Are you seeing the displacement slide there or no?
You're seeing your desktop background.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, my point is, and if I could figure out how to share this here in just one second, sorry about the delay, but there is this document from the Department of Land Conservation and Development that talks about anti-displacement. They've created a statewide toolkit for doing this. And how about, I think I did all the right clicks this time. Does that show now displacement up there?
It does.
Sorry about that. So just the work to be done with that, what I've mentioned, House Bill 2003 on implementation, the state has created this toolkit, their toolkit, and there's this letter, and I don't have a direct link. I can find the link to this letter, but this is dated September of last year. And so they've created, and I just have this screenshot of the beginning of this document. It's maybe a 3 or 4 page document, talks about anti-displacement and gentrification toolkit project for cities implementing House Bill 2003. And so I think as the city looks forward to how we're going to do our House Bill 2003 work, this will be a key part of that process and discussion as well, because it's required as part of that House Bill 2003 work. So just figuring out moving forward, when's the appropriate time to try and implement different tools around that topic. So that's all I wanted to say on that.
Thank you, Mark. Chair Dignam.
So I'm getting the distinct impression that we're probably not going to finalize this matter this evening. Therefore, I would like to add my voice to Chair McGinley and really ask the other Lane County planning commissioners who perhaps haven't brought up any of their concerns, if they can try to summarize their issues, if they're at that point yet. Not that, because I think that will help staff to help us to get through this process if we can get our finger on some of the main points. That doesn't preclude someone from bringing up a point at a future meeting, but I think it sure might help. So if any other Lane County planning commissioner has an idea, this would sure be a good time to share it.
Thank you, Chair. I have Commissioner Cuevila, followed by Commissioner Kaler.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, if you could send that displacement toolkit and any other associated data to the Springfield Planning Commission, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
I'll just note really quick, Arva Hussein, who's helping us staff this project, just put the link to that document in the chat. So if you have an opportunity to visit the chat and click on that link, that should take you to that document. Thank you, Arva, for doing that. But I'm happy to paste that link into an email and provide it to Lindsay so she could provide it to the county planning commissioners as well.
Commissioner Kaler, followed by Commissioner Hadley.
Thank you. I'd like to see us be a little bit more specific about what does concern the Lane County Planning Commission and what only concerns Springfield's Planning Commission. We have quite a few new commissioners in Lane County, and I think from what I can tell, their questions are more because they haven't been involved in the planning work before. And so they're asking more general questions that could probably not take up quite so much time with this hearing or with this workshop. So that's what I'd like. You can see I'm just, it's after 4 o'clock, so I'm an idiot. But I'd like to see this be run more efficiently, although I'm learning stuff and I'm sure they are too. Perhaps what should be recommended is that we give the opportunity to the opposite commission to listen in, but not necessarily be able to comment and ask questions that are not related to their part of the responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hadley.
In response to Stephen's request for a tally from Lane County Commissioners, I'm good to go on the report as written with staff recommendations, and I would leave it to staff's expertise on the parking issue and the lot size issue. I think the only one that's in Commissioner McGinley's bucket that may need further discussion is one that Stephen already raised, and that's the lot coverage impervious. I'd like to hear what a little clearer resolution is on that. And then the last thing is, if we could just get this 500-page document, if we could somehow make it a little more legible, that would be delightful. Without so many red strike throughs, and I'd like to see something that's closer to a final draft without worrying about all the previous iterations. That's it.
Thank you. So it sounds like really the thing I have in a bucket that concerns both of the commissions is related to lot coverage and impervious surface. The rest of it sounds like it pertains to middle housing and the historic district, which would be more of, I think, in my opinion, a city planning commission topic. So my suggestion is that we have some deliberations around the impervious surface topic tonight, and then see where we get with that. If anything else comes up, we can explore that. Then perhaps we could go off and have individual deliberations for the middle housing portion. I'm seeing some general nods from staff. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor for deliberations on impervious surface and lot coverage. Oh, Christina, go ahead.
I do have the two options discussed in the packet done up as PowerPoint slides with some highlighted changes. If it would be helpful for the commission for me to share my screen, I could pull that up. I'm not sure if I matched option 1 and option 2 to the same order they were in the packet, so my apologies there. I will pull that up.
Thank you, Christina.
So you should be, I will make this bigger. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Sorry, so this was option 1 that was discussed in the packet, the changing the impervious surface for lots and parcels that are 4,500 square feet or larger, changing that up to 70% or a different number that the commissions might discuss. I can make changes in the text during the meeting as well. And then option 2 was reverting back to the lot coverage sizes for the lot coverage standard instead of the impervious surface standard. I have drafted these only on to change the text for lots or parcels that are 4,500 square feet or larger, because the provisions around lots or parcels with steep slopes and lots or parcels that are less than 4,500 were not changing from the existing code in the proposed code. But the commission certainly could discuss that. It's just that's not the public comment you've gotten about doing less than what the current code would allow, because 1 and 2 on each of these slides is the same as the current code. Happy to answer any questions if you have them, or you can just start discussing.
Thank you, Christina. Commissioner Kaczynski.
So the way that I kind of see it is that lot coverage and impervious surface are really regulating two completely different things, or related but different things. The lot coverage is really looking at building massing, whereas the impervious surface is a lot more about stormwater. And it sounds like you have a process coming up where you're going to be delving a lot more into the stormwater based on regulations that it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, haven't even been written yet. And so, you know, if the goal is to change the lot coverage and the building massing standards, or get rid of the lot coverage standards, it feels like trying to kind of anticipate some of the regulations that may be coming out about the impervious surfaces. You know, it might be better just to leave it alone and mess with it when those regulations come out.
If I could just interject, Chair, I think what you said is accurate. I think you're right. And just to touch on your comment about massing, I mean, typically we create an envelope on a property, a 3-dimensional envelope between setbacks, height, and lot coverage, essentially, of here's your developable area and to deal with the massing. We intentionally at the beginning of this process did not go down the path of what some people call a form-based code that treats massing differently, more of a design perspective rather than your traditional kind of what I just described, creating this buildable envelope. So I think you're right. I mean, and I think what you say is pretty close to accurate about we haven't drafted the code yet to implement our new stormwater regulations. So that is a forthcoming process. And the impervious surface is really to deal with kind of the anticipated stormwater impacts. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Mark, I'll throw myself in the queue. I think I generally concur with Commissioner Kaczynski's comments. I think if anything, I would prefer regulating lot coverage. I don't know that 45% makes the most sense because we are already implement, or we're already proposing a 10-foot front yard setback, 10-foot rear yard setback, and 5-foot side yard setbacks. So our interior yard setbacks, my apologies. So that already, that already really takes a lot of space on a lot. So I guess what I'm interested in hearing from the commissions is, would you prefer to regulate by impervious surface, or would you prefer to regulate by lot coverage? And then from which one the majority of the commissions prefer, what is the right number for that? So if that made sense, would love to see some hands. I don't function well after 8 p.m., I would say. Chair Dignam.
I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not with this. I'm not quite sure how should be differentiating these two options. I was focused in on impervious, and now we're talking lot coverage, and I guess I need somebody else to try to explain one more time why we're looking at both of them concurrently.
Saw Christina ready to go to respond.
Yeah, I'll walk through these. So the current code has standards for sort of how much of a lot you can cover in a bunch of different places. So the new code tries to consolidate those standards in one place. For the hillside overlay district, it is based on impervious surface, because we know that how much water you prevent from infiltrating has a big impact on landslide risks. So when those hillside overlay standards were put in place, they were based on how much impervious surface you create, which is a more expansive type of lot coverage. We've defined lot coverage as a term in the code to only mean structure coverage. And then similarly for very small parcels, because stormwater starts to become so much of a controlling factor, the current code also talks about impervious surface. So the original recommendation, which is reflected more closely in option 1, is to regulate all parcels based on their impervious surface rather than how much of the structure covers them, so that they're not different types of measurements for different types of parcels. The public comment that you got was that the impervious surface threshold of 65% for those larger lots was too little. You needed to have it a higher number in order to allow essentially what's allowed under the current different definition of lot coverage. So one option 1, is to increase that impervious, use impervious surface for larger lots, those lots larger than 4,500 square feet, but increase from the proposal from 65% to 75%. So allow people to have slightly more driveways or sidewalks or structures. The other option number 2, is essentially reverting back to what the current code allows, which is a lot coverage standard that looks only at buildings for those large lots. So for large lots, you would not look at driveways or sidewalks or other types of impervious surface. We're proposing and recommending you continue to look at driveways and sidewalks and those things no matter what for small lots and hillside lots, because stormwater is such a controlling factor, and we haven't done the analysis on what does it look like if we get rid of those stormwater related standards that were adopted years and years ago. So that's my trying to be succinct. Again, my brain is normally fried after 8 and it's extra fried today. I think people are generally understanding, but I can talk through it again if I need to.
One quick follow-up. So are you suggesting that either option 1 or option 2 both resolve the dilemma posed by Mr. Matthews? Or does only one of them resolve, or do they both resolve?
Likely either one of those resolves it. Option 2, we know resolves it because the example development was approved under these standards. Option 1 is a way to change everything to impervious surface, but increase it enough that we think, again, we haven't done an exact survey measurement, but we think that example development that he provided would meet or fall very, very, very close to the 70%, that even if it doesn't fall at 70%, they probably could have ended up tweaking things in that development to make it 70%. So option 1 and 2 are staff's recommendations to address his comments. There's not, it will depend on sort of the policy choices by the commissions, whether keep things as they are, don't mess with it right now, or yeah, make everything a little bit simpler by doing it as impervious surface, but know that this will have to change again down the road.
Well, in answer to Chair McGinley's question, then I guess I'm ambivalent. Either one sounds okay to me. Whichever one staff thinks would work the best. This is more planning than I'm able to make a reasonable decision on.
Thank you, Chair. I have Commissioner Schultz, followed by Commissioner Kaler.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really wanted to get to what Stephen was asking about as far as if it would have solved Mr. Matthews' dilemma, because I think it's those types of developments that this code is supposed to allow for. And so if we have other things that infringe on that ability, I think that's problematic. I appreciated what Christina said about how option 1 may be more simple and straightforward, which I appreciate. And if we were to go that route, I would certainly be supportive of the 70%. I'm all in favor of flexibility and simplicity for our development community. But I also echo what Stephen was saying as far as I am not a planner, so I am not entirely sure if option 1 is the correct, but if that is more flexible and simple, then I would support that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kaler, followed by Commissioner Salazar.
I wanted to throw a comment, or I guess ask a question. In Sister sometime back and recently in the last 3 or 4 years in Florence, commercial parking lots have used permeable surfaces for parking. It's an asphalt or concrete style, but it allows water to go through it and into a substructure. So I think we are stuck in the idea that parking lots and sidewalks, et cetera, are impermeable, but they needn't be that. And I believe that technology is continuing to develop. So just to put a little different twist on it, is that something that planners have considered might be used, or do you know it to be not a good option at this point? Thank you.
So if I could just respond, Chair. So my first experience with pervious pavement or pervious pavers for parking and driveways was about 20 years ago over in Bend in Central Oregon. They have great soil for that, as well as probably Florence. Here we do allow it, or we have standards and specifications in our engineering design manual for allowing pervious pavement or pervious pavers. You're right, there's different kinds of asphalts and different things evolving. So there's science around that. One of the way our engineering division allows that is it's a percentage basis. It's not like 100% credit. They don't count pervious pavement as 100% pervious, because it still does slow down the rate. The other critical issue around it, especially now as we're moving towards this new stormwater permit, is the difference between clean water and dirty water. Because the city of Springfield gets all of our drinking water from the ground, we're very protective of what goes into the groundwater. And so allowing, say, a parking lot to be pervious pavement and have then all the oils and things from cars filter down into the groundwater is part of the concern. So typically a parking lot would have to be drained to a stormwater catch basin that has filters and technology in it to clean the water. Other than that, it has to go to a vegetative stormwater swale where the vegetation is what cleans the water technically before it infiltrates into the ground. So it gets tricky. The short answer is we do allow for it. One of the biggest things we've learned after having a number of different examples around the city is that maintenance is the real key and also the substrate of it. So it's very critical to have an engineered substrate that allows for it, and then cleaning it, because if those pores, basically it's the open pores of the asphalt, gets clogged up with silt and other contaminants, then it no longer continues to function as it was designed. So.
Thank you, Mark. Commissioner Salazar, followed by Commissioner Cuevila.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I really appreciate staff's work to put forth a simpler option, as Commissioner Schultz was mentioning, in option 1. My concern is that knowing that a change is likely coming with the stormwater permit process, that it's actually less simple to go to change to a simpler option and then change that again, and might be unnecessarily confusing. So my understanding is that option 2 is closer to what's in place currently, and I'm in favor of leaving well enough alone. We know that option 2 works for these sort of middle housing developments, has been shown by the previous examples, and leaving it as is essentially until we determine what those changes will need to be in the new permitting process.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Cuevila, followed by Commissioner Kuczynski.
Thank you, Chair. I recommend option 1 based on it being an engineered analysis that's brought this forward. And I think any change back to the previous code would be unwise, because we'd be going against experts who've made this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kuczynski.
This is a little bit of sort of a logistical question. I'm not familiar with all of the bits of how things in Springfield work. One of the things that I always look out for are places where the code might make a lot of sense for a vacant lot, but can be a lot harder if someone's modifying something where something's already built. I'm assuming that there's building permits required of some kind for any new structure, excepting maybe some very small storage sheds or things. Is it currently, if I wanted to pave my previously gravel driveway or pave my previously unpaved walk, is that something that requires a permit now? Because that would obviously impact the impermeable surface for an existing structure, existing development.
It's a great question, Commissioner, and we have talked quite a bit about that. And the short answer is there is no permit required for, say, paving your driveway or paving your entire backyard as a concrete patio. So we consciously went into this proposed change to impervious surface knowing that it would be hard to track and probably would create code enforcement compliance issues. How we anticipated dealing with that is, one, on a code enforcement basis, but say somebody chooses to pave their whole backyard and then, we don't know about it, they're exceeding the impervious, but then come in later and want to do an addition to their house. It's at that point that it would trigger, oh, we see your whole, from air photos or from their proposed site plan. We notice that they're out of compliance, so it would have to be rectified at that point. But it is a consideration for sure that it makes it more complicated, because permits are not required for creating most new impervious surface in the cases you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Commissioner Hadley, then I'll throw myself in the queue.
In that scenario, so there's a home, when I go to sell my house with its newly paved backyard, there's a home inspector. Is that home inspector liable to point out that my home is no longer code worthy?
I would just say we never get home inspection reports at the city. We wouldn't be aware of any home inspection upon a sale.
Okay.
My question is, okay, I know I said I supported option 2. I tend to externally process and I can change my mind. So I'm looking at option 1 right now. Would implementing option 1 result in any non-conforming developments that say have a large driveway, a bunch of walkways, to an ADU, something like that?
I think it's a great question, and I'll look at Christina maybe again on this, but I will note that in Mr. Matthews' testimony, it was instructive to me to look at the numbers that he came up with, because so even though the lot for, and I'm talking about that duplex that I shared the air photo of, and that he provided a site plan diagram of, the numbers that he came up with, even though 45% is the maximum lot coverage for structure, those duplexes came out at 35% lot coverage and at 70% impervious surface area. And again, it's a unique situation because of that paved shared driveway, but it's barely meeting the proposed 70% if we increased it to that impervious surface, but it's well under the maximum lot coverage. If they had, say, improved those lots at 45% lot coverage, they would be way over the 70%. So anyway, I think that's my roundabout way of saying, in my mind, it would be highly likely that it would create non-conforming properties. And so again, when somebody were to come in now for a new, say, addition to their house, we'd say, oh, we changed the standard on you. Now you're over the standard and you can't do an addition to your house unless you rip out a bunch of pavement somewhere or something like that. So I think that's probably a pretty real scenario.
And a follow-up question to that, if I may, is House Bill 2001 also allows for the conversion of single detached dwellings to middle housing. So if someone had more than 70% impervious surface coverage, would they not be allowed to, or not be permitted to convert their existing dwelling?
Yeah, another great question. It's all getting the mind trust around all these issues. And I haven't thought that one through. Christina, do you have any thoughts on that? I noticed you came off mute.
Yeah, sorry, my sick child just got to come home from the emergency room, but she's in the room with me, so I'm gonna leave my camera off for the rest of the meeting. I would say that if it would depend on when they created the impervious surface, if they just gave us receipts from their contractor or pictures with a date on it or something and show that that was predating this code, then it would be a non-conforming building, and non-conforming buildings can be expanded so long as they don't increase the non-conformity. So they couldn't create even more impervious surface, like create additional violations of that standard, but they would not be blocked from developing middle housing, but before they brought it back down to 70, if that makes sense.
And I think part of that non-conforming is they can be altered as long as the non-conforming doesn't become more non-conforming. So at least the internal conversion of an existing home to, say, a middle housing, as long as they weren't adding new impervious, would probably be allowed. But it's a great question.
Great. Thank you for that clarity. And just for my line of thought, I'm thinking about, are we creating non-conforming uses with some, or not non-conforming uses, non-conforming dwellings with the impervious surface? Are we going to limit any development opportunities? I'm also thinking about the proposed code currently allows for detached middle housing type. So you could add a dwelling to an existing dwelling and call it a duplex. Would we be able to allow that, or would we be able to allow that to happen right now with this? So I don't know the answer necessarily, but that's just where my thinking is at. And I welcome any other thoughts. Also acknowledging that it's 8:40 now. Chair Dignam.
I'm inclined to listen to the comment. I think it was Springfield Commissioner Salazar who recommended, I won't try not to put words in his mouth, but recommended that we go with option 2, just leave things the way they are. Because that seems to me to be the simplest approach. It solves the issue as raised by Mr. Matthews. It was legal then, it would still be legal in the future. So I'm changing my mind from supporting option 1 to the leave as is option 2. Commissioner Salazar, isn't that what you That was what you said. You were not the changed option 2, but the leave it as is option 2. Is that correct?
That was the point I made, yes. And
Okay, so
I still am weighing, I think, similar to Commissioner McGinley, kind of weighing both options. I see the pros and cons of both. But that was, yeah, my argument for option 2.
So if anyone was doing a straw poll, that's where I am as of right now. Leave it alone, option 2.
And this is Commissioner Smith from Lane County. I straw poll, I'm there.
And can I just clarify it, and maybe Christina can weigh in, but so on the slide that's up now is option 2, it says attachment 2, and then the change version of attachment 2. On the bottom of the attachment to the first column, it says 65% of the lot. Oh, that's impervious. So we would, so the change column on the option 2 that I think we're all looking at is basically leaving it alone, keeping it what it is today. So I think that's what I'm hearing people are supporting is let's just leave it what it is today. That is a 45% lot coverage. And then essentially we're not changing anything around this topic from what's in place today. Does that
Thank you, Mark.
Right?
And I think this could be another one of those things where in our recommendation to City Council, if this is something that the City Planning Commission is interested in revisiting, we can request to revisit or request to have them direct us to revisit, direct staff to revisit after the stormwater standards are adopted, if that is a path we'd like to go down. Okay, could I request that we stop sharing so that I can see folks perhaps for a straw poll? So could I get a show of hands for not option 2, leaving it as is for now? So that's okay. So I'm seeing a majority there. Okay. Thank you. That helps provide clarity. So we're approaching the 3-hour mark that I know that the County Planning Commission has. So are there other topics tonight that you wanted to bring up that specifically involve, those non-grayed out areas? Commissioner Kaler, I see your hand is up. All right, Commissioner Kaczynski.
I just wanted to, in the other proposed edits on page 9, I do see the definitions of driveway approach, definitions of kitchen, the comments about the urbanizable fringe and making sure that duplexes and ADUs are listed consistently throughout. The comments about more than the walkable, like that whole list. I think everything except the definition of lot coverage, or no, the definition of lot coverage, including 18 inches eaves, all seem to be things that nobody highlighted as things they really wanted to talk about. And so if we support staff, including that, and we want that to be a recommendation as part of the recommended changes, it seems reasonable to take that poll when we're all together so that it's consistent.
Thank you, Commissioner Kaczynski. That's an excellent idea. Could I have a show of hands for folks who are in support of those proposed changes to the definitions? Great. That looks like the majority of us. Okay. So I'll do a temperature check. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner Kaczynski.
Oh, sorry. He went to the next slide and it answered my question.
I have the same, sorry, Chair McGinley, I have the same slides for the 2 changes that to urban fringe overlay standards as well. I don't know if you want to go through those tonight. Those are definitely relevant to the urban fringe area.
Fantastic. I think we could get through that or at least start it and see where we get. So Christina, do you mind, or perhaps Mark, since Christina has her child?
I'm happy to explain. Okay. The change here is to align with what the standards already state that they allow, and the state law requirement that we allow duplexes in these locations. So it is catching sort of an oversight rather than a departure from policy. And this was, I think, stemmed from Commissioner Kaczynski's comments that she sent along.
Great, thank you. So could I get a straw poll of all those in favor of this corrective change? Great, okay. So I think our options now are we could begin to close tonight and then go into individual deliberations, specifically thinking about the city and all of the middle housing things. Staff, could you outline what that would look like?
Sure. So, one of the things I heard tonight was provide a cleaner version of all the code. And I think what we can do is provide the code with these three things that we just had a straw poll on and incorporate those changes and maybe highlight. So create a clean version, highlight these three changed areas, but then also have a remaining list of the topics that you've mentioned in your buckets that need additional discussion. Those topics, from my standpoint, are primarily, like you had said, middle housing and historic district related types things. So I also heard the comment about potentially having the Lane County Planning Commission just listen. So again, I'm going to leave it the discretion to you whether or not you would want to be joint or separate. I think in my mind, the next available meeting date is February 1st. And it would be pretty quick turnaround, but I think we could do that and have a complete packet ready for either a separate city council only, or I keep saying city council, it's late for me too, my apologies. A city planning commission meeting February 1st. Potentially Lane County planning commissioners could attend as, the public or attendees if they chose, or have a joint meeting. I would see, I think this is what you're asking, Chair, is I would see if they were going to be separate, that we would do maybe city first alone, and then say come back to county, either alone or joint, like at the February 15th meeting. And so anyway, those are just the ideas off the top of my head, or what I've pre-thought about and how I would see it going. Is that what you were asking, Chair?
Yes, thank you. So could I get a show of hands for commissioners who are supportive of the City Planning Commission doing individual deliberations on February 1st? Okay. That looks like, I think the majority. Okay. It's at the same time as the County Planning Commission. And I think I heard Lindsay say that your February is unscheduled as of yet. So if you would like to tune in, you could tune in. Is that correct, Lindsay? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And then we would do our city specific deliberations, and then the County Planning Commission would schedule deliberations for after that. And then we would come back together. Is that correct? Okay. Chair Dignam.
I'm not sure, and perhaps Lindsay can help me, but I'm not quite sure I would see a reason for the county to get back together just as our sole group, because it seems like when we've talked through the issues which we were going to need to talk through, clearly we have to get back together jointly in order to, or well, maybe that's not entirely required, but we want to make sure that we're passing the same measure, the same recommendation as the city. So you'd think we'd want to get back together jointly to do that. But I don't know, Lane County Planning Commissioners, do we want to have a separate meeting just by ourselves? We do? Somebody needs to say something, because
what I think might be helpful is if we have a meeting with ourselves, but with a member or two of the Springfield staff that could answer our questions.
Okay.
Because as one of the other commissioners pointed out, we have a lot of questions that the Springfield commissioners already know all the answers to. But, we're looking at a 600-page document still. Even if we've read it, there's still a lot of things in here that we don't know, that maybe, our smaller session with staff to answer some questions would be helpful.
Anybody else? Bruce, what do you think? Charles C. Kathy, anybody else? Charles C. says yes. Nobody else. Eliza's saying yes.
Is the city close enough that in one more meeting of the city alone, you guys will have, you'll be in a position to forward this for recommendation? Don't know.
Just from my standpoint, I think in theory, the city planning commission could come to a formal recommendation, say at February 1st. And then we could bring to the county planning commission on the 15th what that formal recommendation is. If you're in agreement and feel like you can get your questions answered, we can discuss and deliberate on any county kind of specific questions. You then that night could also get, I don't think you have to be together to make recommendation. If at the 15th, it seemed clear that you weren't going to get to the same place that the county could, or the city did on the 1st, then we'd have to figure out another meeting. The other option in my mind is city only on the 1st, no recommendation, county only on the 1st, maybe no recommendation, and then the final meeting jointly, probably March 1st, for both to reach a final conclusion.
But from my perspective, if you guys make no recommendation, that leaves me kind of up in the air. I'm deferring to city staff and city planning commission for 80% of this document.
Yeah, Lindsay looked like she was going to chime in on something. I think you're right that the city, the city recommendation kind of has to lead, and then the county recommendation follow in my mind. But
so if you guys reach that point on the 1st, then I'm ready to review it on the 15th. Is that the other date you gave? I'm ready to review it in that point. And if something really egregious sticks out at me, then I'm going to raise my hand in my inimitable fashion and say I object. But I think that's kind of unlikely.
I like that plan.
Lindsay,
what do you think?
Yeah.
I think what I was going to comment on kind of resolved itself through that discussion. I was just going to say, yeah, typically we do have the city planning commission make the first recommendation, but they don't have to be at the same meeting that the county planning commission makes their recommendation. The county can make a recommendation later.
And part of the reason for that is, Mark, you guys have done a terrific job in explaining this to us. Yes, it's been long, and yes, it's been exhausting, but you and your staff have just done a dynamite job of making things clear. And so that's why I think that if your group is ready to make a recommendation, I'm comfortable with a county only meeting, but I defer.
I'm thinking that I can speak for the rest of the planning commission with the nods I'm seeing, that Bruce's idea of meeting on the 15th after you meet on the 1st is something that we would like to do. What kind of a motion would staff suggest that we make in order to do that?
I don't think any motion, at least for Springfield's perspective or public hearings perspective, I don't think a motion is needed, at least for us to pick that topic back up. It would just be scheduled on agendas. But I look to Lindsay in terms of whether county procedures require a motion to bring something else back up. I know for Board of County Commissioners, they require a motion to set another reading on an ordinance, but I'm not aware of if that same requirement applies to planning commission orders.
I feel like traditionally we have gone through the role of making a motion to continue deliberations to a date certain. So it doesn't have to be a time certain necessarily, but at least a date certain, so that it's, if anyone goes back and watches the recording, they can follow the breadcrumbs of the information. So I would recommend a friendly motion.
Does anyone want to make that motion?
I move that we continue deliberations on February 15th as a date certain.
Second.
And do we have a second?
Second.
And seconded by Bruce. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Motion carries unanimously for Lane County Planning Commission.
Right. Thank you everyone for getting through all of that tonight, staff and commissioners. Before I close our public hearing, I'll just request that before I close the regular session, I'll just request that the city planning commissioner stay on for just 5 minutes after we close and stop recording. We just have a quick announcement. So I adjourn the Springfield Planning Commission regular session. See the city planning commissioners on February 1st, and I'll hand it over to Chair Dignam.
Thank
And
you,
I
everybody.
adjourn the Lane County Planning Commission regular session for January 18th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the great conversation tonight.